Hello again and welcome back to Middle Mission Testify Out Loud. Now, let's transition from the second part of the introduction into this third part by attempting to make sense out of the providence of God in practical application to where we all live, work, and play in everyday life experiences where the rubber meets the road in the God talk, so you can form your own truth. And that has been my mantra throughout my vlogs is this is about you coming to your own truth, not just believing what I'm saying or anyone else. So let's transition from the idea of spiritual storms. Now, relative to spiritual storms, like all natural storms, they will eventually give way to the sun shining brightly again and an uncloudy day. That's natural relative to the changing of the seasons in our climate that was ordained by God under his watchful eye in the book of Genesis 10, where he makes a covenant with Noah stating that the earth would not be devastated by a flood again and that the seasons would continue from spring, summer, fall, and winter. Now, in light of that, he put a rainbow in the clouds of heaven as a sign of his faithfulness to do just that. And the analogy is relative to spiritual storms. Storms will come and go from generation to generation until they culminate fully in the sun shining brightly in an uncloudy day in the new Jerusalem on this earth where God's kingdom, his house, will be filled with God's people. That's the culmination. But prior to that, humanity will go through good times, bad times, evil times, good times. So I want you to hear that in terms of God's wise providence with this caveat. And the caveat is those good times in bad times are subject to God's people being what God called them to be. Listen carefully. Call it the church, call it the community of faith, call it disciples, whatever you want to call it. But in essence, we are followers of the ways of the Lord, which is the way of righteousness. Call it what you want, but as his agency of reconciliation on the earth, the people of God and each other must love God, love each other, and build a life support system through faith, hope, and love. Now, that's under the providence of God. That's how it works. So I want you to listen very, very carefully as I establish that point. So, the providence of God begins in eternity and runs throughout time. So it means good times and bad times will vacillate, will fluctuate back and forth from generation to generation until it fully culminates. Relative to spiritual storms mentioned in the previous vlogs, we see a semblance of that in Genesis 11, where I talked about the providence of God by establishing the covenant with Noah and placing the rainbow in the clouds, which speaks of God's faithfulness. God's providence in that context is about how God manages the universe and our world, how he manages it through free will of people in the world without tampering with their wills, but letting them have their way. Now, I know that's a hard pill to swallow. Now, we've got to see that in context. In that context, when we sum up the judgments of God in Scripture, I've said this before, when we collaborate and connect the Scripture, dot upon I, rather, dot upon dot, crossing the T upon T, being consistent in our interpretation of Scripture. It means that God does not judge us. Rather, we judge ourselves by resisting and disobeying the revealed will of God's reality in our lives and turn away from God to another source. And in this day and age, it's becoming wealth. Jesus said, a man cannot serve two masters. We cannot serve God and mammon or the spirit of wealth. We'll either love the one and hate the other. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of the things which he possesses. That wealth, greed is becoming a huge deterrent online from people turning away from God, which could be the great falling away. So hear me very carefully. God, in his providence, his wise providence and omniscience of foreknowledge, sees that in advance before it happens. And he doesn't tamper with that, or he doesn't impose on that. He lets people have their way to allow the bad times, the consequences of that, the difficulties of our choices, and the error of our ways to expose evil, to reveal to us that God's way is the best way. That's God's providence. So I want you to hear that carefully. The results are bad times, and evil people, watch this, will not win. I'm going to point that out later. You have nothing to fear, nothing to be afraid of as you observe all of the things that's going on in the world that seems to be blasphemous, that's threatening violence, that is toxic. You don't have to be afraid of that because it will not win. It will fail and it will fall. Come back for part 4.